The scorching asphalt burned against his hands and knees as he crawled, humiliation weighing heavier than the summer heat. Laughter echoed from the officers standing over him. Men sworn to protect, now using their power to degrade. But what they didn't know was that life has a way of flipping the script. Years later, that same man walked into the police station, not as a victim, but as the new chief. And he had a message for those who once mocked him. This is a story about justice, redemption, and the unexpected twists of fate. How did he rise to a position of power? What did he say when he came face to face with the officers who had humiliated him? And most importantly, what happened next? Stay tuned as we unravel a powerful true story that proves dignity can never be taken. It can only be reclaimed. Years before he became chief, he was just another young black man trying to make it home. That night, a routine stop turned into a nightmare. The officers didn't see him as a person, they saw an opportunity for a cruel joke. They ordered him out of the car, told him to crawl like an animal, and laughed as he scraped his skin on the rough asphalt. He swallowed his anger, knowing that speaking up might only make things worse. But what they didn't know was that this moment wouldn't break him, it would fuel him. He refused to be defined by that night. Instead, he worked harder, rose through the ranks, and earned the respect of his community. When the day came for him to take over as chief, he stood in that same station, looking at the faces of the officers who once mocked him. They had no idea what was coming next. The room fell silent as he stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing his face but unable to place it. Others kept their expressions blank, unaware of the past that was about to catch up with them. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the very men who once laughed at his pain. They had forgotten him, but he had never forgotten that night. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for something bigger. He had spent years learning the system, working twice as hard just to be taken seriously. Now, with the power to create real change, he had to decide what kind of leader he would be. Would he let anger guide him, or would he use this moment to rebuild the department from the inside? The officers waited. The next words he spoke would change everything. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, thick with unspoken tension. He could see it now, the flicker of recognition in their eyes, the uneasy shifting in their seats. They remembered. The smirks and arrogance they once carried had vanished, replaced by something else. Fear, not of punishment, but of consequences. He let the silence stretch, making them feel the discomfort they had once forced onto him. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the force of years of restraint. He didn't need to yell. His presence alone commanded the room. "This department has a history," he began, locking eyes with each officer. "A history that can no longer be ignored." He saw jaws tighten, hands clenched into fists. Some looked away, while others met his gaze with defiance. But then he asked the question that made their blood run cold. What happens when the people you once laughed at are the ones writing your future? The room was frozen. No one dared to speak. The weight of his question lingered in the air, pressing down on the officers who once saw him as nothing more than a joke. But before they could react, he pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Inside were files, detailed reports, complaints, and overlooked misconduct. Cases that had been buried, names that had been protected. He had spent years gathering proof, waiting for the right moment. And now, standing before them as their new chief, he was ready to bring it all into the light. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others remained still, their expressions unreadable. He could see it, the fear, the regret, the silent calculations running through their minds. Some thought they could still escape accountability. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a voice broke the silence from the back of the room. "You don't know everything." He turned slowly, his heart pounding. The voice belonged to an officer he hadn't expected, someone who knew more than he let on. And just like that, the game had changed again. All eyes turned toward the officer who had spoken. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his voice, a quiet confidence, a warning. The new chief held his gaze, steady but alert. "What don't I know?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer stepped forward, tapping a single finger on the folder. "You think you have the whole picture," he said, "but some of the worst things never made it onto paper." The room felt even smaller now, the air thick with anticipation. The chief's grip tightened. He had spent years preparing for this moment, but he hadn't expected this. Then the officer spoke again. "You aren't the only one they did this to." A slow realization settled in. This wasn't just about him. There were others, people who never got the chance to fight back, whose voices had been silenced. And just like that, the mission changed. It wasn't just about justice, it was about uncovering everything. The chief took a deep breath, realizing the weight of what had just been revealed. This was bigger than a personal reckoning. This was a pattern, a cycle that had gone unchecked for too long. He wasn't just here to settle an old score. He was here to break that cycle for good. In the weeks that followed, investigations were launched. Officers who had abused their power were held accountable. Whistleblowers, once too afraid to speak, finally stepped forward. The department was no longer a place where corruption thrived in silence. It was becoming something new, something better. One evening, as the chief walked through his office, he glanced at his old file, the memory of that night still fresh. But instead of anger, he felt something else, closure. He had turned his pain into change, proving that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure no one else had to crawl the way he once did.